Audio Jungle.
It's the first time that a NATO member has downed a Russian plane in half a century. Turkey has shut down a Russian jet, and one of the pilots has reportedly been killed. What will be the fallout of this, coming at this sensitive time in the war on Syria? Well, in this edition of the debate, we'll discuss what possible motives Turkey would have had by this act and how this would impact the Vienna talks held over Syria and the crisis, and also France's push for coordinated action with Russia against the Daesh terrorists.
Turkey has shot down a Russian military plane on the border with Syria. Ankara says the Russian plane violated its airspace and ignored repeated warnings before being brought down by Turkish fighter jets. But the Russian Defense Ministry says it can prove that the aircraft was over Syria for the whole flight. The Russian president condemned Turkey's move, calling it a stab in the back.
Ваше Величество, спасибо большое.
Today's loss for us was a stab in the back from terrorist accomplices. I can't qualify this in any other way. Our jet was shot down over the territory of Syria by the air-to-air missile from a Turkish jet F-16. It fell on the territory of Syria, 4 kilometers from the Turkish border. In any case, neither our pilots nor our jet posed any threat to Turkish Republic. This is an obvious thing. They were conducting an operation fighting ISIL.
Putin warned that Turkey's move will have serious consequences for ties between Moscow and Ankara. He also said large amounts of oil from anti-Damascus militants in Syria go to Turkey. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov cancelled a planned trip to Turkey that had been due on Wednesday. He recommended against Russians traveling to Turkey for any reason. The Russian Defense Ministry has summoned Turkish defense attaché in Moscow and says it is working on a package of measures to respond. Meanwhile, Turkish Foreign Ministry has summoned Russia's chargé d'affaires. Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu says Ankara has the right to all kinds of measures against border violations.
Everyone should know that in accordance with commitments made at our meeting last Sunday in our security, that despite repeated warnings and in accordance with our international commitments, it is our national duty and it is our right to take all necessary measures against those who violate our airspace or our land borders.
Following an official request from the Syrian government on September 30th, Russia launched military airstrikes targeting positions of Daesh and other terrorist groups in Syria. The Russian Navy has also contributed to the fight. The air raids support Syrian army forces on the ground. This has angered Turkey, which has long sought the ouster of President Bashar al-Assad. Turkey and several regional Arab states have been seeking to topple the Syrian government. They began their efforts even before the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011. There have been many reports about the state-sponsored networks of smuggling weapons and militants into Syria. Some view Turkey as the prime suspect in facilitating the ISIL's oil trade.
Well, joining us for this edition of the debate, we have James Jatras. He's a former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst who joins us from Washington, D.C. And also Mehmet Solmaz, who's the news editor of the Daily Sabah, who joins us from Istanbul. Gentlemen, welcome. Mehmet Solmaz, I'll first start with you. Do you think Turkey was right in downing this Russian jet, which as a result is now 2 Russian pilots have been killed?
Well, the Turkish armed forces released a statement saying that the jet was warned for 10 times in 5 minutes time, and it did not give any message to the warnings. And finally, the Turkish Air Forces downed the jets. And in regards to the fate of the pilots, people on the ground, they report that one of them is killed, and there's other sources saying that both of them are alive, and Turkish government is in touch with the rebels there to get those pilots safely. Well, we cannot confirm their fate yet.
James Jatras, we're looking at a very dangerous escalation here. Russia has said, a variety of their officials, that there was no warning. How do you see what has happened, and what are the consequences?
Well,
I think we have to talk about a couple different things. To start with,
We have to distinguish what did or didn't happen, and we will see in the coming days whose depiction of the facts are correct. I think more important are the politics here, especially after the attacks in Paris. I think Mr. Erdogan, who is a big supporter of Daesh and of al-Nusra and of the other jihad terror forces trying to overthrow the Syrian government, was very concerned that more and more Western opinion is swinging in the direction of cooperating with Russia in a joint anti-terrorist campaign, and that was something that was very upsetting to Mr. Erdogan. It is correct that Turkey is one of the biggest supporters of the terrorists in Syria. It's also correct that Turkey is the essential lifeline for oil exports from Daesh-controlled areas. And this is something worth many millions of dollars to middlemen in Turkey and perhaps even to the AKP party. So I think he is looking for a way to throw a monkey wrench into that growing rapprochement between the West and Russia, and this is a ploy to do that. Let's also keep in mind that there have been several incidents, even before the Russians were involved, where Turkey has tried to stage provocations against the Syrian forces and call for NATO protection under Article 5, although NATO is supposed to be a defensive alliance, not an aggressor, as it would be here in Syria.
James Jatras, do you think Turkey attacked this jet, or do you think NATO did, Turkey being a member?
Oh, Turkey, of course, but they will seek to wrap themselves in the NATO flag and say, oh, we need to invoke Article 5 and defend Turkey from this aggression, when in fact it is Turkey that is acting as the aggressor and the provocateur in Syria.
Mehmet Solmaz, there were lots of accusations there leveled against Turkey from our guest. What do you think? Are they all true or false? Go ahead.
The gentleman in US seems to be having his own world, you know. He's saying that Erdogan and the AK party is supporting the Daesh terrorists or the other terrorist groups in the war-torn country. And there had not been any single evidence shown for this. And if we're talking about oil smuggling, why not the Russian jets or the regime is attacking Raqqa or the oil fields there? We could ask this question. And as I said, there had not been any single proof. And in regards to the Turkey and NATO link, I could say, like, whether we like somebody or not, Turkey is a NATO member country. And if its airspace had been violated, this means NATO's airspace has also been violated as well. And since last Thursday, the regime in Syria and the Russian forces, all together with the Liwa al-Zulfikar from Iraq, the Shiite militia, and also some fighters belong to the Marxist organization called, led by Mihraç Ural, a Turkish citizen in Syria, fighting along with the Assad regime. Their numbers are around 10,000 in total, and attacking an area where there is no ISIS presence at all, which is around the Turkmen mountain area in Latakia, and there is no ISIS there. So why are you not focusing on where the ISIS is? And this also conflicts with the statements made after the Vienna talks. The regime and also Russia made different statements after that, and we all thought that things going to be different and we're going to have a new era starting. However, the escalation of violence just right next to Turkey's border and attacking Turkmens, which many Turks cannot accept. You know, it's their brethren, and they've been there since the 10th century, and they've been attacked by the regime continuously for the past week. And some of the parts of the Turkmen mountain was in the regime hands. However, today we hear reports that the area had been cleared off from regime and its allies.
Well, you know, it's interesting, James Jatras, when you hear some of the statements made there, please give us your reaction, because it's very confusing as to overall what Turkey is doing based on what you have said, James Jatras. Go ahead.
Well, a couple of things. Let's keep in mind that a couple of weeks ago in Antalya at the G20 summit, Mr. Putin embarrassed the Western powers, and especially embarrassed his host Turkey, by providing very concrete proof of how oil is being exported by Daesh through Turkey. There's no mistake as to what the relationship is here. Regarding the Turkmen militias and the forces in northern Syria, let's keep in mind two things. One is these are allied with al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, And the Russians and the Syrian government have made no secret that they consider all these terrorists, whether they're Al-Qaeda, whether they're ISIS, or whether they're all allied with one another, to be enemies of the legitimate government of Syria and legitimate targets for the Russian Air Force. Let's also keep in mind that these Turkmen militias are essentially run by Turkish intelligence agents, so that we know very well that the Turkish authorities are deeply involved in Turkey in a very direct sense, including with their own personnel, in support of terrorist groups, including elements of Al-Qaeda.
Your response, Mehmet Solmaz.
Well, in regards to the Turkmen presence, they've been there all the time, and from the reports that we hear and their statements from the Turkmen brigades, such as Sultan Abdulhamid Brigade in Latakia, they said they have no single connection whatsoever with any terrorist organizations. But yes, Free Syrian Army is also regarded terrorist by the gentlemen there, or the Syrian regime. So they are part of the Free Syrian Army, and Turkey is exactly deeply involved, as the gentleman said, but with the moderate Syrian opposition groups that its allies are also supporting as well, which consists fractions of the Free Syrian Army. There is no hidden agenda. I mean, like Turkish Prime Minister or other Turkish officials continuously said, like, we are helping our Turkmen brothers, just like, in all sorts of ways. So from this you may understand anything, from all sorts of ways. So there'll be, and that's probably why 10,000 men, including regime troops and Shiite militias or Russians, not able to get the Turkmen mount since last Thursday.
Okay. Let's take a look at the developments, James Jatras, how they have fallen in line since we see the success of the Russian airstrikes along with the Syrian army on the ground and Iran in its advisory role. Lots of progress has been made, which has culminated into some major advancements. And then you have the Vienna talks. But then once these advancements came into fruition, you had the Paris attacks. And then after that, you had this state of alert that was all over Europe. And then you have what has happened now. Do you get the feeling that these incidents are preventing Russia, or trying to prevent Russia from its ongoing achievements and success? Because it seems like all these events are happening at the time when there was lots of success happening with on the political side and, of course, on the ground.
That's correct. In fact, if you look at the comments made by Mr. Obama today in his meeting with Mr. Hollande, who is here in Washington, saying that the Russians could be playing a positive role in Syria if, of course, they agree with us that eventually Assad must go, Assad must go, Assad must go. That mantra is still emanating from Western capitals. And as long as we have this diktat coming from Western powers saying that we get to decide who runs the government of Syria, and in effect trying to vindicate the policy of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries that essentially want to impose a sectarian Sunni state in Syria and are willing to do anything they need to do in order to achieve that end, it's hard to see how we can come up with a true united front against what supposedly we all agree on, which is that Daesh is a threat to the entire civilized world. And that's where we in the West need to make up our minds. Are we serious about fighting Daesh, or do we want to play this treacherous game where we're against Daesh, but we also want to support Daesh or Al-Qaeda or other allied groups, some of them so-called moderates, that are really not very moderate, because the real enemy is to get rid of Assad, and frankly, from Washington, the real enemy in many cases is still Russia in the minds of many American policymakers.
Well, it sounds like that's what Turkey needs to do, Mehmet Solmaz. Is Turkey serious about fighting Daesh?
Can you repeat your question again, please?
Is
Sorry.
Turkey serious about fighting the Daesh terrorists?
Well, it blacklisted tens of thousands of people. It deported hundreds of them, thousands of them, and it had been hitting Daesh targets for the past several months. And just about 2 days ago, it hit a Daesh position near Aleppo, and those positions were later in the hands of the Turkmens there. And so Turkey continues its fights. But one thing I wanted to mention was that diplomatic talks were at a high level last week, and everybody were optimistic about a transition period. And what Turkey now says is like Assad regime and its allies hitting Turkmens in the northern Syria. Northern Syria is broken into parts. In some parts you have the YPG, PKK-linked Kurds, and on the other side you have some a Daesh presence, and then you have moderate Syrian opposition groups, including Turkmens. And why the regime is only focusing on these moderate groups, but not Daesh or the YPG that it has very close links with. So Turkey says, like, before entering into a transition period with the Syrian regime, Syrian regime probably wants to get back a border somewhere that it can have a connection with Turkey. So that's how I could interpret this thing. And on the other hand, claims on Daesh, I think, is simply empty, and there had not been shown any single proof so far in the past 2 years.
Okay, well, let's move on to that. Let's move on to that press conference, James Dutross. Unless you have a reaction to our guest, the press conference with François Hollande in Washington with the U.S. president. It was very surprising hearing some of the statements from François Hollande, which seems like it was in line with the U.S. And this came as a surprise because the reaction that Hollande had and the ensuing joint cooperation that France had announced with Russia to go fight the terrorists didn't sound like that was in place anymore, at least based on what the statements were made. Do you think that the U.S. was quick to try to bring Hollande back into its camp before it left the camp of the U.S. and its allies?
Yes, I think that is very much a goal of American policymakers. They're very concerned about the earlier statements Hollande had made about cooperating with the Russians. And of course they know that he is also going to visit Moscow. And the last thing they want is to see a genuine cooperation between any of our allies in NATO with the Russians that is not based on our demand that Assad must go. So I think there's a concern there. This also points to how will NATO react. As we know, there was a consultation of the North Atlantic Council today to respond to the shoot down of the Russian planes and the Turkish claim that NATO needs to secure Turkish security, which of course is not under threat by Russia or by Syria. It is Turkey that is interfering in Syria illegally. We'll have to see what that reaction is. If the French and the Germans especially have any regard for their own interests and are not simply taking their marching orders from Washington, I hope we will have some pushback in NATO against this very dangerous provocation